Few announcements start with Katie will be reaching out to the residents for next year's residence research year. It's this time of the year for residents who want to take a year away. I think it's important that they communicate with Katie and myself so we can find the mentors and then plan the class and the class size with Dr. Patel accordingly. So stay tuned for that announcement. And then I want to thank all the faculty who have volunteered to help with the residence interviews. We're looking for more residents as well. So if you can let Jess know, that would be great. This is an important part. We have 5 interviews and we have outstanding cohort of applicants that we actually were unsure whom to select, to be honest with you. It keeps getting better and better. So I appreciate everyone's help and support. Also want to thank the 3 residence presenters for M&M. I'm very pleased with the direction of the culture and the discussion that we have. It's very healthy. Dr. Balters, I think we want to not forget about hypoxia as a main cause reason for altered mental status. So we appreciate elevating the rigor and bringing high level of evidence and keeping the conversational educational. I have the honor of introducing one of our own, Dr. John Aucar, who is a general surgeon, trauma surgeon, a minimally invasive surgeon who has been part of this organization for many years, including being a chief medical officer and now the trauma medical director at Mercy Council Bluffs. He is a leader in surgical education, simulation, and trauma critical care. He completed his residency at Michigan State and held multiple leadership positions, including being the founding program director at a residency program in Urbana, Illinois, worked in the Bentab trauma unit in Houston, Texas, was also the chair of surgery at University of Texas, Tyler, and has been through multiple leadership positions here with us and other organizations. He's on several committees throughout the American College of Surgeons and other societies, and heavily published in surgical education, simulation, trauma, and critical care. Today, he's going to talk to us about a chance to cut is a chance to cure. Also, I have his permission to announce that Dr. Aucar, despite multiple attempts from me to convince him otherwise, plans on retiring this June of 2026. I'm hoping you're still going to change your mind. However, he told me that's his final decision. So we appreciate your service to the department and everything you've done to support us and support the organization. With no further ado, I appreciate you coming with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow, such a nice applause, and I haven't done anything yet. You know, my wife has told me I should learn to quit while I'm ahead, so thank you all very much and goodbye. Today's talk, as you see, titled Chance to Cut is a Chance to Cure. Can everybody hear me all right? This mic, I want to make it too close and too far. So I wonder how many of you have heard this? It's a classic old surgical aphorism, right? Before this title, obviously, that you've seen now. You've heard of it? Not heard of it? Whether you've heard of it or not, I would think it wouldn't be very hard to think of its primary corollary, right? A chance to cut is a chance to kill. So this is to remind us that while we practice a very noble and gratifying profession, it is also a dangerous one. It requires basically everything we have in terms of dedication to come out with the first outcome preferentially over the last. Nobody has a perfect track record, of course. Anybody who operates has complications and will have even deaths to deal with. Now, very easily drawn to the verbs in this statement: to cut, to cure, to cut, to kill. I also like to draw attention to the other little hidden important word back here, chance, because chance is kind of ambiguous in this setting. You know, we think of an obvious context of opportunity. This is a privilege for us to practice, and that's why we gain privileges where we are. And sure, opportunity is a very, very important thing. It's talk about that by itself for a while, but the other context of chance is in the sense of a statistical probability. And it reminds us that we have to, whether we realize it or not, we think in terms of statistical probability and probabilistic outcomes in just about everything we do. And we're always trying to stack the risks, obviously, into our favor. So the main themes that I'm going to talk about here: career development, surgical finances and economics, and some comments about cultural change. As mentioned, I've been in practice now for, this is my 34th year in practice, finished residency in 1992. And I've seen a tremendous amount of changes in the clinical things we do. As you can tell from my comments, I usually try to throw in a historical perspective. One thing I always do when I'm asked by students or residents, hey, what's it like? Is there life after residency and so on and so forth? So yes, of course there is. And I can tell you everything I know about what life is like right now. But in all probability, it's going to be very different by the time you reach my stage in your career. Even what the students are learning now, by the time they're residents, you'll realize it's an evolving and moving target. What the residents are learning as you go through your career, you're going to abandon practices, you're going to adopt new ones. So it is by all means a very fluid profession. Now, by way of the usual disclosures, I have no financial conflicts of interest. I will be talking about finances later. If I say something that I think might have a conflict, I'll point it out. We're asked to mention the Ignatian values because, this is a Creighton event. And this is, routine. We sort of pass over it sometimes. As I was getting ready for this, I started realizing, gee, I don't really know who this Ignatius guy is. How many of you know the story of St. Ignatius? Yeah, okay. Somebody coming to this place would, maybe look that up. He was a Spaniard named Inigo Lopez de Loyola. He was a Spanish nobleman in his youth, became a military man, was severely wounded in battle. Interesting is his leg got clipped by a cannonball. Medicine at the time, obviously fairly primitive. This was 16th century. It healed, but healed in a very crooked fashion. And during a long convalescence, he had time to reflect, and leading to his conversion, ultimately became a prominent player in the Counter-Reformation movement. Also, by reputation, a bit of a party guy too. Loved to have his fun, and was the founder of the Jesuit order, and him and his friends. So one other interesting quip about him is because his leg had healed in such an angulated and deformed manner, he actually had the doctors at the time break it again and put it on a rack and stretch it. And so, hey, not too different than maybe external fixators that we use these days in orthopedics. This talk is going to express a lot of opinion, and maybe some controversies. I've been known to try to look at things in an alternative way, sometimes contrarian. And I don't expect all of you to agree with everything I say. In fact, I'd be very disappointed if you do, because that means you're not thinking hard enough for yourselves. And I think the key feature that you have to do to be successful is think for yourself. I realize sometimes this can cause a little discomfort and be out on the edge, but it's okay because Brene Brown says good communicators have a tolerance for discomfort. Does everybody here know who Brene Brown is? Me neither, but looks like she's from Texas, but so she should be okay. Anyway, just in case I go out on a limb and I push you beyond your limits of comfort, I wanted to make sure everybody had an easy and reliable mechanism to file a complaint. So I established a complaint hotline and I put my granddaughter in charge. And so you can just call 1-800-COMPLAIN or send an email to complaintojoe@hotmail.com. She'll make sure that your complaints are properly filed and disposed of in a very expeditious manner. So anyway, as you go through your careers, it's all a process of development. And we like to think that we're all individuals, and yes, we are, but we're also in a lot of ways very much alike. The factors that influence who we are, who we become, don't just boil down to these four elements, but they're prominent elements: background, your formal development, informal development, and experience. Now, my background, okay, full-blooded Lebanese, 2 generations removed, born under communism in Havana, Cuba, grew up in a small town in South Central Kansas as a doctor's son. There's probably someone out there could tell the same story, but I had a bit of a rebellious youth, adventuresome. Some would call it Augustinian, without the subsequent revelations. But anyway, you learn a lot as you come through. And when we get to formal development, those are the things that we get degrees, diplomas, certificates from. We all have a lot of that in our lives, right? I went to college with the idea of being a doctor and being a surgeon specifically. My father was an ENT. I had an interest. I've been, while I say my perspective on surgical practice goes back at least 34 years since residency, probably goes back 50 or 55 years, because as a kid, I watched what my father did, was very interested. But when I went to college, I found out pre-med wasn't a major. And so I started taking alternative classes, saying, I'm going to study things I don't get to study later on. I ended up being a philosophy major. And I think that's been a tremendous help to me and, the way I form perspectives of things. But you become an abstract thinker. And we as surgeons tend to be concrete thinkers, right? But it's important that, people distinguish this as left brain, right brain activity. It's very important that we learn to balance those things. They're both very useful. And if you get too far out on a limb in one mode of thinking, you kind of sell yourself short and miss opportunities. I kind of wonder, how many of you all have alternative non-science majors from your undergraduate experience? Good. What was your major?
Accounting. Finance.
Accounting. All right, good. It's set up for business, makes you think, no engineers here. Engineering's a popular kind of thing to study on your way to medical school these days. No other fine arts, social science, psychology, things that are actually very important in our lives, but we don't tend to spend too much time studying. Music or musicians, not counting Dr. Lane, we know about him. No other musicians here. I mean, I'm an amateur musician, play purely for the good times, purely for fun, not a performer. But I think it's an important part of formal development. Then you hit medical school, of course, and you all your attention, your rigors into the science, residency, similar things. You become very focused and sort of fewer and fewer opportunities to diversify. Now, for me, informal development, there's lots of ways to approach that. I like audiobooks, and I discovered audiobooks about 20 years ago. Burn surgeon I was working with at the University of Missouri says, hey, I read this cool book. My wife and I really like it. Think you'll like it. You can borrow my tape. And yes, it wasn't a box of cassette tapes. That book was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Now, I don't want to cause cultural divide here. How many people are familiar with Harry Potter? No, just a few. Oh, okay. Well, some people very familiar with it. I like these stories. I got attached to them. It was a bonding experience with my daughter, who's a precocious reader. But I learned that I could listen to audiobooks in the car on a 20-minute commute back and forth to the hospital, spend a certain amount of time on the highway, blah, blah, blah. I've been able to bang out about 15 to 20 books per year. When you think about it, that's 300 to 400 books over a 20-year period. And it is a tremendous opportunity to develop yourself. Most of the time I was reading business, leadership, development, cognitive psychology, interspersed in there with things like quantum physics, a bunch of biographies and things like that. But it really helps and develop a perspective that is important in what we do and even learning to talk to people. And then, of course, there's the experience factor. Dr. Al-Rafai kindly pointed out that I've been around the block. I chose an adventuresome career that involved moving. I had several 5 to 6 year jobs punctuated by 2-year misadventures where got myself into things that, I thought this is what you read about in the paper. I'd never get mixed up with something like this. It includes direct opportunity to visualize, not participate in fraud, extortion, a variety of nefarious activities in the medical profession, in the health world. I would say that, in fact, I've actually been close to or in proximity, absolutely not involved with, suicide and even murder. Okay, so things happen out there in the world and they creep up on you that you don't realize. And it's very important that you're well prepared to deal with them. Now, I'm going to digress a little bit and talk about how it is that we form our worldview and our source of truth. There was a time, way back when the primary guide that helped us through life and figure out how things were priests and shamans. It was a mystical period in history that, people didn't understand the world and turned to somebody to help us figure this out. But that evolved and changed. There's this thing called the printing press that was developed with incentive for people to learn to read. Now all of a sudden they could stimulate thought, think for themselves. Then the scientific revolution came along, and we are all attached to that. The things we've learned in science, the academic environment. And we'd like to think that the world is still driven by science and academia. The problem is that the science became too complicated, so advanced that most people couldn't understand it, couldn't keep up with it, and had to turn to alternative means of understanding the world. And everybody know what that became? Next step? The media, of course. So people learned, what they learned through attention to mass media, began as newspapers, then radio, then TV, and the internet. The first version of the internet, of course, was a one-way delivery of information. It's more powerful, more convenient, faster way to deliver information. But then the internet became interactive so that everybody can put stuff on the internet, right? You don't have to know how to set up a web server or do any of those other things. We reach this point where oftentimes we derive our truths from crowdsourcing, right? Everybody's throwing in their comment, we read it, social media, blogs, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a tremendous power in that, but there's also a tremendous risk in that anybody can put up whatever they want and people are tempted to believe it. There's a couple of books that, I'll be citing several books through here. You can assume that if I'm citing a book that I've read it, unless I point otherwise. And another thing I was going to say about books, I know that nowadays it's quite popular to derive a lot of your knowledge from a quick Google search or, little summary notes here and there, or podcasts. Those are all good sources. We all use them, myself included. But I don't think that they can deal with topics to the depth that a well-written book can. And so I still would encourage reading books when you get the opportunity. And none of us have time to sit down and read a lot, and that's where audio comes in. So in The Wisdom of Crowds, James Surowiecki talks about how groups make better decisions than individuals. That's because, decisions are made in groups based on a sum of the knowledge that the group members bring into it, a certain amount of known information, and a certain amount of unknown and presumed information. So for the presumed information, sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. Those factors tend to cancel each other out in groups, leaving them in a better position. Of course, he also talks about things like mass hysteria and, groupthink and all the downside of groups trying to make decisions. These issues become very important when you start talking about committee work, which is a lot of what governs our lives. There's another book related to this group thinking and the power of groups called Messy, The Power of Disorder to Transform Our Lives. And this author, Tim Harford, points out that groups tend to build themselves around agreements. Everyone wants to think the same, be the part of the group, influenced by the chair of the committee. But the more valuable members of any group, whether you're talking about committee work, a research project, or whatever else, is the skeptic, the one who thinks differently, the one who says, wait a minute, I'm not buying that at face value. You're going to have to convince me that you're really making sense. And when I formed committees, I always make it a point to invite dissension and invite the alternative opinion. Same thing with research projects. I don't want everybody to just tell me how good it is. I want people to help me make it better. But that takes a certain amount of tolerance of discomfort, right? You have to be able to deal with disagreement and dissent and become stronger for it. Another important book that I would recommend for all of you is this one by Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers. Basic, summary theme on this is he notes that success is a product of hard work, opportunity, and luck. We sometimes underestimate how important luck is in our worlds, what we get to and what we achieve. Probably the best treatise on the power of randomness in our lives and the effect of luck is one called The Black Swan by Nicholas Taleb. Good book, a little bit of dry reading, but you may have heard of the term black swan as these unexpected major events that, no one saw it coming, but when you look back, you say, oh, that should have been pretty obvious, could have seen that coming. Another key theme here is how individual achievement deeply shaped by cultural background, timing, and a series of accumulated advantages. Very important comment, I think. These are just other books by Malcolm Gladwell that I'm not going to go into a lot. I'd recommend Blink, which is sort of a sort of summary, funner version of a broader, more difficult to read book by an author named Daniel Kahneman, who was one of two psychologists that ever won a Nobel Prize in economics. But he talks about this difference between snap judgment, fast thinking, and the title of the book is Thinking Fast and Slow. How we knee-jerk responses sometimes, and then other times we stop and think and digest and make decisions under degrees of a lot of degrees of uncertainty. And that's very important in what we do as surgeons as well, because we're called upon to make decisions with limited information under difficult settings, and then have to digest them and think them over later. Dave and Goliath, another good book, Talking to Strangers, very important. I don't have time to cover all these things, but I wanted it in there in case anybody wants to go back and look and get references. Now, here's a book I haven't read, but it's been pulled out some very important concepts in life. The duality between individualism and collectivism, personal interest versus societal interest. This author, Geert Hofstadter, wrote this based on study of IBM, a multinational corporation where culture was quite varied. He had to figure out what it is, what were the things that were driving both success and failures under these circumstances. Other dimension, masculinity and femininity. This doesn't have to do with gender assignment or identification or anything like that. These are qualities that all of us have and share and express to different degrees. And that's, a concept that actually goes back to ancient Greece. I won't go into now. Our tolerance of uncertainty, and then our long-term and short-term orientation, and then the power-distance relationship. This is crucial to surgeons because we are sort of at the pinnacle of the power-distance dynamic. Whether you realize it or not, we intimidate other people. Even other doctors, right? The internists, family physicians, touchy-feely types, nice people, pediatricians. We're definitive, concrete thinkers who lay out our plan, go after it, and we tend not to be as touchy-feely sometimes as those that go into other professions. And if you have a power distance dynamic there, imagine the power distance that we carry over our patients, right? Patients still, you can spend all day talking to them about risks and benefits and alternatives. And the next thing they say is, well, whatever you think, doctor, what do you think I should do? I'm willing to go with that. That's still probably the single most common response patients give after any discussion of options. Now, the power distance dynamic is important in a lot of ways. But there's a dark side to this as well. In this book, Thomas Nichols talks about the death of expertise. This is the trend that we've gotten ourselves into as a society, where people think that a quick Google search, quick summary review, so on and so forth, makes them an expert, to the point where they challenge those that have spent their lives focused on a specific area of study and have developed a tremendous amount of experience and have a perspective. College students, and he's a college professor, he says, as students come up and say, hey, I pay tuition here, so you work for me. I want you to teach me, this stuff and, what I learn. And his answer is, no, you don't, I don't work for you. You pay tuition to support the institution. I work for the institution and they pay me to teach you what I think is important. And so sometimes, the downside of too much power distance is people are afraid to speak up. And, airline captains have driven their planes into mountains because their co-pilot was too embarrassed to say, hey, wait a minute, this instrument over here is pinging and you're not looking at it. Draw their attention. Again, the input, multiple inputs, put you in a better position. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that those who are inexperienced or have limited perspectives on subjects can override decisions of experts. Sometimes you see that, people trying to say, I don't understand what you're doing, but it doesn't look right to me, and therefore I'm going to make a big stink about it. And that's not the extreme you ever want to find yourself getting into, because it can seriously jeopardize outcomes. Now, I mentioned something about, individualism and societal interest. That's the key theme of this classic work, Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy. I won't tell you about the plot. I'm not even going to recommend you read it. It's really kind of dry unless you're into postmodern Russian drama, which I happen to like some. But if you like that, read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. In any case, what I want to talk about is the Anna Karenina principle. The book is famous for its first line: happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Well, this is talked about in business and engineering and even in healthcare and interpreted to mean that there's only one path to success, but many paths to failure. And, the idea is that if you have a complex system or a complicated system, if any one component of it breaks down, the system can fail. You have to have sort of everything working in unison for things to work right. And that is kind of true in some ways, but it doesn't account for fault tolerance and redundancy in systems. And in surgery, fortunately, we have a fair amount of fault tolerance. Of course, it depends on the scale. Microvascular anastomosis, less tolerant than small vessel anastomosis, less tolerant than large vessel anastomosis. And, the most tolerant is probably a GI anastomosis. So anyway, this is an important concept to think about: redundancies in systems and how one can actually achieve success without necessarily having to achieve perfection. Talk a bit about clinical development. I would say, whether people realize it or not, your chief year in residency is probably the smartest you're ever going to be in terms of book knowledge. That's where you're prepared to really answer questions. You've done a lot of reading, so on and so forth. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're at the pinnacle of your career. In fact, you're first starting, you're at the bottom. And most of the time, you can bet it takes 1.5, maybe 2 years or more to actually get comfortable with the idea that you're ready to deal with whatever walks through the door, whether you've seen it before or not, because you've seen enough variation and you've built on it. Now, the other thing is, early in your career, you tend to practice the broadest scope. I used to do broad scope of general surgery. I did peripheral vascular surgery for the first 9 months I was out, including at a vascular mecca in Houston. I didn't have a vascular certificate. Practiced critical care for a lot of years and taught critical care in an accredited residency, but I didn't have a certificate. And my residents qualified to take the exam, but I didn't, because I didn't do a fellowship. Long history behind that. What I'm pointing out is the general tendency that when activities are new, everyone can kind of get into it. If you look for the opportunity, you pursue it, you can build skills. As these things mature, then all of a sudden they become formalized and you need a certificate. So if you get opportunities to do, fellowship, specialized study, things that sort of codify and formalize your development, it will help you later on, even though it may seem like you don't really need that certificate now to practice in that area. We all know about the ACGME competencies. Before they were 6. We talked about surgical competencies requiring 3 things, the 3 A's: availability, affability, and ability. And those things then can be expanded and dissected in various ways. People think of the technical aspects of surgery being where the mystique is, but really surgery is a very cognitive activity. The decision-making is crucial, and you shouldn't get all wrapped up into the idea that it's all about sewing tubes together. The World is Flat is a book by Thomas Friedman, where he talks about globalization and how we all now no longer just compete locally, but have to compete on a much broader sense, in advances in communication, transportation, make our lives easier and make our lives harder as well. But he talks about this idea of the generalist and specialist. And, I've always been proud of the fact that I'm a generalist. I got to practice general surgery before it was all fractionated and carved up in multiple subspecialties and so on and so forth. And things worked pretty well, but the world evolved and went on, developed a tendency towards specialization. Now, division of labor is the foundation upon which civilization has advanced, right? So obviously necessary, and we need specialists, but originally specialists were evolved as a means of addressing the most difficult cases in a particular area. Yet the specialists need to eat too, and maybe there's not enough difficult cases, so they practice some in the general field and general dynamic, and that's important and useful. But if the pendulum swings to the point where everybody specializes, you get the scenario where, there's more and more people that know more and more about less and less. And they say until everybody kind of knows everything about nothing. And you still have the difficulty of integrating specialty activity, coordinating, and there is a role for generalists. Friedman makes the point that the future belongs to the versatilist. This is somebody who develops a relatively, deep understanding, not super deep, but relatively deep understanding across a broad variety of subjects, right? And that puts you then in a position to do more with your talent and your skills and do more work. And right now, we're in the scenario where it takes 4 or 5 doctors to do what I used to do by myself. So I didn't consult nephrology every time the creatinine went to 1.6. I didn't consult ID just because the patient was on antibiotics. ID was reserved for the immunocompromised patient who'd been on 3 previous rounds and had failed and had a, multi-resistant organism. And now you got to figure out what to do with that and has renal failure and so on and so forth. But now, we see this tendency where we kind of load the boat. And that has implications when we talk about finances in a few minutes. Well, here's, one of my favorite statements about the practice of medicine comes from Franz Kafka. He was not a doctor, but often say that he knows more about being a doctor than some doctors. And I would paraphrase this. He says, to write prescriptions is easy, but to come to an understanding with people is hard. I'd say to do the operation is easy, but to come to an understanding with people can be hard. So I wanted to just do a brief comment on clinical ethics, because this is where this end of life decisions and discussions come into play. I think we tend to do ethics backwards, right? People look at a difficult situation, decide how they feel about it, what they want to do, and then they look for ways to justify it. Proper approach to ethics is to be familiar with some underlying ethical theories, to be able to identify a value system, and then put those value systems into that theory, develop principles, and then act from there. The three main ethical theories that people talk about is Kantianism, categorical imperative, do what you would want others to do in this setting. Obviously, it's similar to the golden rule, but can be traced back to as they say, all of modern philosophy traces as a series of footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. The other major theory, utilitarianism, the most good for the most people, and then social contract theory that, we're all part of a group and we give up certain rights for the benefit of society, and that, we're still looking for the best for the most. I did spend quite a number of years on ethics consult services, both at the University of Missouri and the University of Illinois. And I think people have this sort of misperception about what the ethics consult service does. They think that they're going to come tell them and give them a recommendation about what the right thing to do under circumstances are. And it's really not that way. The most they might ever do is tell you what's the wrong thing to do. Don't do this. But oftentimes there's multiple right potential approaches to things. And when you do that identification of values, identification of, the theory you want to work under, and then the principles you want to follow, then you can figure out what's the right thing to do. They very often are helpful in resolving conflicts between care team wants to do this, family wants to do that, or whatever, but never expect them to really make your tough decisions for you. Educational development, I think you guys get a lot of this. I'm not going to go into it. Key book I think everybody should read, Mindset. There's, I've watched education develop from way back when work hour reform was just starting. The very first case, Libby Zion's death occurred when I was a resident, and my chairman, Dick Dean at Michigan State, we were doing work hour reform research long before it ever became formalized and codified. And what we took was a practical approach. If you were post call, you got to go home early, but it wasn't based on the clock. It was based on make your contribution to rounds, help the team get set up to do the rest of the day's work, and then take off. And if you follow kind of reasonable principles, life is good. It's actually when they formalized it and said, no, you got to go home in 24 hours. You got to do this and that all kinds of problems occurred. I was on various committees and task force trying to look into the future of how education should go. Very gratifying activity. Probably my most gratifying project was developing a residency in central Illinois at a community hospital affiliated with the university, where the entire faculty were non-academic background, and learned that really doing a cookbook for a PIF, a program information file, is relatively easy, but actually driving behaviors and building culture is a challenging part of our behavior, of our activity. And that residency is still viable. It's received, various commendations. I'm not going to go into details of that story. So I seldom read slides verbatim. I'm going to do a quick one here. Now, you don't make a lot of friends quoting Machiavelli, right? He's known for his sort of ruthlessness approach to gaining power. And that's not the theme of this quote. But it ought to be remembered there's nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of new order of things, because the innovator has for enemies all those who've done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders and those who may do well under the new. So being a change agent, if you want to pursue any kind of leadership role, and not really everybody wants to be a leader, believe me, career development is very different than leadership development, even though those things overlap. But you have to realize that not everybody's going to like you. You will have to make tough decisions, and just by virtue of the fact people think differently, you're stuck with that fact. Research is something that I think everybody should participate in during their training, whether you want to pursue an academic career or not. Nothing teaches you how to read a paper like writing one, right? Going through the process, seeing how they're developed. I do a whole talk on framing surgery around art, science, and craft work, and would say that we have kind of a delusional overconfidence in the reliability of our science. It's kind of ironic that we build statistical models in which to describe the world, but then find out that we're trying to fit the world into the statistical model. There are pitfalls in research and academic activity, pressure to public mediocre work. There's activity with ghostwriting these days, and AI is taking over the world. Those are all themes that you should be aware of. I'm not going to go into too much detail because of time. Remember, it's important to participate in service activities, whether it's in your institution or outside. Professional societies are kind of waning these days for economic reasons and the availability of communication without having to be there. But if you have opportunities to participate in professional societies, committees, or officer roles, or just as social activity and for CME, I think that's important. The Surgeons Pack of the ACS, we don't all have time to be politically active, right? And you think about, you spend the first 2 or 3, maybe 4 months of the year working just to pay your taxes. It's nice to have somebody that is looking at what the legislation is being considered, so on and so forth. I did the advocacy course by the ACS together with Beth Sutton, who y'all might recognize was here a month ago from Wichita Falls, outgoing president of the ACS. We went and lobbied on Capitol Hill together. Another adventure that I'm not going to go into details about. Administrative development. Okay, so you look at this, there's all kinds of opportunities. We talked about formal degree seeking things. I believe that leadership, in my case, was kind of an organic development. I didn't set out to say I want to be the boss. I would rather work for a good boss than be a boss in a difficult set of circumstances. But in the circumstances, when circumstances are difficult and people see you as a problem solver, then they start asking you to solve more problems. Committees and task forces, whether you realize it or not, do a lot to rule our world. And you see bad decisions coming out of those. If that's the case, it's your fault for not participating. Every level of development has its focus. As a director, you're thinking about how your program fits into the into the division. As a division chief, you're thinking about how your program fits into the department, maybe how it relates to other related divisions, cardiothoracic surgery and cardiology, obviously intimately related. It's not till you reach the level of chair that you really start thinking about how your field fits in the broader scope of the organizational mission. You have to relate to the other chairs and the other departments, whether or not they're directly involved. I mean, dermatology or ophthalmology or whatever that don't play a big role necessarily in our lives. And yet you realize that you're competing for resources. And then, of course, as you move above that to dean for a medical school or vice president of a hospital, you really start getting the big picture view. And the considerations are different. I'd recommend keeping track of your activity. Of course, the CV is the ultimate document that you use, but I found this CARES model early on: clinical, administrative, research, education, and service. Keep a running list of the things you participate in. It's tremendously helpful for annual reviews, and it helps you wrap your mind about what you're actually accomplishing, what you're doing. And if you ever get an email from Elon Musk says, name 5 things you did last week, you're ready for it. Quick rundown on healthcare finances is a topic. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but you've heard the U.S. has a reputation of very high cost of care with very poor outcomes by a number of high-level measures. And we spend 18% of GDP on this. The theory is if you spend too much in any one economic sector, the rest of the sectors collapse because there's not enough money left over to support them, right? Spend too much on healthcare, nobody can afford a car, energy goes down the tubes, next thing you know, everything else does too. People talk about, well, what the physicians are making too much, and everyone says, oh, but the doctors say we're not making as much as we used to. Turns out that about 20% of healthcare expenditures come down to physicians and clinical services. And I'm not sure you could carve this up and try to drill down into what's included or what's not included. But hospital care is probably the biggest component. This basically shows how over time, in recent years, specialties, particularly procedure-based specialties, have had their reimbursement rates cut, while the medical specialties and general medicine in particular, family medicine, had reimbursement rates increase. There's a shift from paying for procedural services to medical services. But at the same time, overall, physician reimbursement in general has declined over time, while hospital reimbursement by CMS and other payer services has increased dramatically. And they'll say they increased cost of doing business, got more administrators to support, blah, 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 and all that's true. But this is why you see this trend of physician practices giving up and saying, I can no longer cover the cost of doing businesses based on the standard and classic model. And they then sell out to larger organizations, hospitals, and systems. It turns out that physician salaries actually haven't been decreasing that much. They've been keeping steady and rising over time. This is Medscape data. Our institution uses MGMA, or Medical Group Practice Management Association. The latter is probably a little more reliable, but the trends are still there. So the idea is, how is it that reimbursement for services can go down, but salaries can be maintained? That's because hospitals are subsidizing the physicians. That happens in our organization, happens in many others. And that's the way we're able to buoy up our salaries. And they say they want to keep us working because they charge more, help us cover salaries. But what it in effect does is gives them control and takes control out of our hands, because now we have to kind of play along. So doctors make more in the US than in most any other place. I don't know how much that contributes to that, weird graph about high costs with poorer outcomes, but that's just comparing countries. And yes, women still seem to be underpaid relative to doctors, but this doesn't include data, some of which is published, that talks about women are more likely to be on part-time arrangements and so on and so forth. So if you're on a production model, chances are that there's really not going to be a lot of discrepancy there. You're looking for practices. Maybe you want to know that the Central Plains, where we are, is in the highest paying areas of the country. I worked for a long time, and this area down here is one of the lowest paying areas of the country. And at Baylor, I used to make the 10th percentile for Southern academic surgeons. Anyway, we talked about this reimbursements going down, cost of doing business going up, sell your practice to the hospital, become employed, whether you like it or not. There are alternatives, but you have to really know what you're doing if you want to get into those. The tradition, I compare everything to the traditional private model. You go out there, you hang your shingle in a town, borrow a bunch of money from a bank so that you can set up an office, troll the ER, troll radiology for cases, hope you get enough money flowing through that eventually you can hire a full-time nurse and so on and so forth. In the employed model, all that's taken care of for you, but again, has its other disadvantages. Single specialty groups are the most efficient from a resource utilization, particularly for surgeons, because we don't spend all the day in the office. Multi-specialty groups have high overhead and end up using some cross-subsidization, things like that. Anyway, a whole variety of compensation models that you can get into when you go out there. We're not going to discuss all of them. You can do some math, but you need to learn what they all mean. Be careful up here if there's a big signing bonus and a big salary up front. There's usually a clause that says if you don't stay, you got to pay it back. And I've seen people get caught in that trap. And then non-compete clauses are coming and going. They're trying to make them illegal. What about debt? So, many of us come out with debt. I did, and some of you do as well. I would say the old classic, quote the old classic saying that if you think an education is expensive, consider the cost of ignorance, right? You'll be a lot worse off without that. But when you realize that your income is going to increase by fourfold from the day you finish residency to the day you start practice, you shouldn't go out and buy a fast German sports car, or you shouldn't go out and necessarily buy the house next door to the cardiologist that's in practice for 15 years. You should concentrate on doubling your lifestyle, pay off your debt, refinance interest if you can. When I finished, interest rates were 15%. So you guys got this cakewalk in terms of financial burden. But anyway, pay off your debt, then learn to invest and grow your nest egg and build for the future. I did want to give a talk about, personal finances and how to manage all that, sort of expand on those latter couple of slides, but obviously not today. So we'll close where we started. A chance to cut is a chance to cure. It's also a chance to kill. Surgery is a noble profession. Don't be tempted into pessimism by all the, hardships and challenges that we have going on. Pessimism is self-defeating. Pollyanna optimism, on the other hand, can lead you into complacency and not realizing that it can be better than it is. And so we always want to seek improvement and just realize that the world is changing. Anyway, thank you all for your attention. I'm glad to take questions and or rebuttals.
Thanks so much, Dr. Aucar, and thanks again for your service to Creighton and CHI. Questions for Dr. Aucar?
Thank you, Dr. Aucar. I thought there was a lot in there to think about in somebody's career, especially early in their career. Maybe one comment and one question. The comment would be, I think pursuing additional certification can seem ridiculous when you're in the middle of a residency, but it is a good idea. I use myself as an example. I had a thoracic attending who was like, "Oh, Marcus, you don't have to do a fellowship to get palliative care boards," when I was a CT fellow. And I was just like, is this person crazy? I would never take the time to do that. Well, now I think being involved in palliative care would be amazing, but you have to do a year fellowship. So it's a little less likely that I'm going to set everything aside and do that. The question I had for you relates to the book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. So for young surgeons and students still trying to decide what to do you think in the OR, thinking fast or thinking slow is a better place to be?
Yeah, great question. So, one of the things that we think about the goal of surgical training isn't to do every operation. It's to learn to think like a surgeon so that you kind of know what to do when you don't know what to do. And that goes back to being prepared by understanding the principles. And whenever you encounter some, new and different situation, it's how well prepared you are that's going to determine how that works out. So yeah, thinking fast is useful in the OR. When the blood hits the lights, put your finger on it. Don't panic, sew around it, close the hole, do what you got to do. A number of times gotten proximal and distal control with somebody simply putting a finger on things. That's the fast knee-jerk response. But deciding how to reconstruct the thing, repair it, so on and so forth, that takes thinking slow. That takes thinking about principles, drawing upon what you've learned, what might happen if you do this or you do that, and then making your decision. So like many of these things that are posed as dichotomous choices, there's not one that's better than the other. It's about how to integrate and overlap those.
Thank you. Questions from Zoom or any other questions for Dr. Aucar? Dr. DeRosa.
I just, going back to the women being underpaid as physicians and the hypothesis that potentially that's because they are working part-time. I just want to say that a person's value is a person's value, and that women societally have a lot more pressure on them in the home to take care of children. And a lot of women drop out of surgery mid-career because they are challenged by these things and underpaid. So as somebody who is retiring from surgery, how do you recommend we engage female surgeons and still allow them to lead a lifestyle that is appropriate for them?
Yeah, that's another great question. And, obviously you're bringing up a difficult subject and one that's, sensitive because it tends to draw upon, a lot of emotional considerations. First of all, I'd say that there are many women who've had very successful careers, but they had to make sacrifices for it, right? By successful, I mean made as much as men, published as much, done as much. But there's always a give or take there. Throughout my career, I have had times where I've followed the money, and I've had times where I've walked away from the money. So sometimes you have to, if you want to, I don't know if compromise is the right word. If you want to have multiple interests, the same principles apply in academia. If you want to spend a lot of your time publishing, doing research, fine, but that's not going to pay as well as clinical activity. You have reimbursement models that are based on work hour RVUs or work RVUs. If you generate productivity, you're going to get the benefit of that. I think we're sort of misaligned if we think that how to make the most money is the goal of our practice. I think what we're looking for is a gratifying practice, helping people, making the world a better place. And sometimes that's going to be by doing, several different things. The role of women in child rearing, that's, you can't put a price on that. It's worth more than anything. It's a dilemma that we've had in the past, we're going to be with in the future. I think the important things are under salaried models, it's important that women be given equal consideration. I mean, equal work, equal pay. That's certainly a principle we can all get behind. But even men, have to make that choice of, I want to take Wednesdays off in golf. Well, that's a non-productive day. I'm going to, I can't expect to make as much as the guy that wants to work 5 or 7 days a week. And, I don't have a good answer for you. I think ensuring that your value is recognized based on the skills you bring to the table, your commitment to advancing the mission of the institution, so on and so forth. But all of us to some degree feel like, we're abused. Organizations taking advantage of us, getting more work and blah, blah, blah. If somebody feels like that, I'd say educate yourself on your value and use it as a negotiating tool to get your worth. But don't think that, we're going to make just as much as the next guy, even though he's working harder or, whether you're a man or a woman, some people want to work more and others don't. It's tough. We got salary models that disincentivize productivity. We got productivities that create, misaligned incentives leading to overuse. Again, one's not right and one it's wrong. You got to integrate and overlap. I hope that gives you some satisfaction. May not be a great answer.
I will not be satisfied until there is equity in salary between men and women. But that being said,
Mhm.
I do think negotiating upfront, and if institutions were more transparent with what their partners were earning per year, that would help in the negotiation.
Yeah.
So I'll close. Thanks again for that important question, Durham said. Gender pay inequity is a reality, and we have to close it. I think in part is the negotiation process. So here within CHI, the pay and compensation schedule is very transparent about who does what. As a chair, when I'm negotiating with candidates, regardless, make sure that we offer them what we have and then help them negotiate better. So I do think I'm in agreement with Dr. DeRosa about the comments.
But there's no gender component in that compensation model, right? There's not, do I understand that right? There's no
Correct.
gender.
Correct. Having said that, we have to be mindful that some people negotiate differently than others. And then as an institution, we have to be mindful of that we support that. Because eventually, if we don't do that correctly up front, you're not going to be able to retain people down the road. So yes, the productivity model supports working. However, we have to be mindful that the gender equity gap that exists has to be closed. All right, thanks again for your ground rounds. I know that we have some announcement, Dr. Castling. Then Katie, do you want to make the announcement why Dr. Castling is pulling up setting up?
Okay, I'm here to talk briefly about the resident research year. We are opening up applications for second and third year residents. I'll send out an email today with the application link. If you have any questions, please